So last time we were talking about the globalization theory of Neil Ferguson, the idea of Anglobalization, the notion that the British in the 19th century gave us an adumbration, a foreshadowing, a prior model of globalization that tells us a lot about the condition of globalization of the present time, present globalization with the United States as the center. It's still a globalization that is dependent on the idea of the gold standard. It's still based on the notion of free trade. It still has essentially the outlines of British political economy as its centerpiece, thinking of the writing of Milton Friedman and most of the most extreme versions of laissez-faire capitalism that have been promoted in the last 40, 50 years. They are an imitation of British political economy in the 1820s and 30s. Milton Friedman has said so frankly. He said that he wishes, or he wished, he's no longer with us, but he said that he wished we could get back to the very solid economics of the 1820s. He said that on a number of occasions, and a number of people agree with him, and that was more or less the doctrine of globalization. And I think it still adheres. I mean, we still have it with us to a great degree, although it's an enormous crisis at the moment. Anyhow, this notion is that there's an analogy to Anglobalization, as Ferguson would put it, in the 19th century. Remember, we were talking about some of the lessons from world history, and I tended toward the view that there isn't much that world history can really indicate to us about globalization. I mean, except in the sense that history always tells you something, but there isn't a precise model there of globalization that we can find. But this notion of the globalization of the 19th century, that is worth talking about. Not to say that I endorse the notion there's an exact copy, we are repeating history, or any of that, but just to suggest that there is a good deal that points, in our direction, and a good deal we can consider. And there's also the idea that this notion of an English prior model, this Anglobalization, is really part of the ideology of globalism in our time. So for that reason alone, this would justify our investigating it further and asking some questions, the questions a historian would ask about this question of a prior English model. Well, did it fail economically? That's a big question that is put to us. Frieden takes this up in his History of Capitalism that we're reading for this course. Did it fail economically? Well, Frieden, gives us a pretty good picture of it. And with all its complications, with all the things we've said about it, I don't think you can say in the final analysis that it did fail economically. How did it fail? Frieden says it fell in World War I. Well, he says World War I and then the ensuing events, the ensuing period, the next 10 years or 15 years or so, which allows him to include the Great Depression. So you say it failed in the World War, and then it refailed, so to speak, or it redoubled the failure in the Great Depression. But really, strictly speaking, he cuts off the narrative in 1914. So the model of globalization in the 19th century for Frieden pretty much makes the case that it ended with World War I. So an economic model ended with a world war. That did not end because of its inherent failings, or that it was coming apart. He does not even say that the business cycle was indicating ever more greater depressions, ever more greater crises. Not so. In fact, he makes pretty much the argument that the German Social Democrats, led by Edward Bernstein, began to argue in 1897. The argument that, depressions were very severe in the beginning of capitalism, but as it developed throughout the 19th century, the depressions were getting less severe. That's the argument. Less severe. And for that reason, maybe depressions are going away. And we enjoy a laugh at this idea, thinking about the Great Depression, which is looming in the beginning of 1929, you know. But back in that day, 1897, depressions are getting less severe, perhaps Bernstein said. Maybe the socialists ought not to think so much about class struggle and the dictatorship of the proletariat as the German Social Democrats were thinking. They were under Marxist leadership. They had all the trade unions pretty much siding with them. They looked like the party of the future. They became the plurality party, the party with the most votes in the election of 1912. Every German pundit and politician looked to the future and thought the Social Democrats are going to be the government. If that is to say, if we continue to let them vote, they're going to be the government. So they started to wonder what's going to happen. There's going to be some terrific crisis. We're going to have the introduction of socialism or some piecemeal approach to socialism, incremental passage of various laws that tend in the direction of social, great crisis over this. There's a big argument that was had at the turn of the century. Are the crises getting worse? I think Frieden comes to the conclusion that this isn't the case, and he even talks about a big revival. And as a matter of fact, in our discussion, we were talking about how, if you want to think of it in terms of the capitalist system as a whole, it enjoyed a number of victories at the end of the 19th century. I mean, the American plutocrats won out over populism in the defeat of Bryan in 1896. You could even say that their confrères in the former Confederacy, they won out, establishing Jim Crow in a big way with the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So it is a big victory for the plutocracy, for the centerpiece, the main people running the capitalist system in the United States at any rate. A big victory for them at the end of the 19th century. You could say even that the British won out in the argument about free trade when the policies that were advocated by Joseph Chamberlain pretty much went by the board, and that debate pretty much evaporated. And the British did not turn to tariff protectionism, did not admit did not imitate the United States and the Hamiltonian tradition of tariff protection. And so you can see there's a number of victories for this model of Anglobalization. And nevertheless, in Frieden's account, it falls. That's in the title of the book, Fall and Rise. This is the fall. So it's not an economic fall, it strikes me. Not an economic fall, but a fall in war. Now it makes us ask a question between the relationship between economics and politics here, the relationship between the globalization theory and the actual political system that underpinned it, that made it possible, I would argue, file analysis. You could argue that, in a way, economics makes politics possible. You could make this argument if you looked at this in terms of a general philosophical discussion in terms of natural law. You know, economics makes politics possible. But I think you could just as easily argue that politics makes economics possible. And it's sort of the strain I'm pursuing in this course. So let's try and answer this question. If globalism didn't fail at the turn of the century, why did it fail? That is to say, if it didn't fail in an economic crisis, if it didn't come apart economically, and I think what goes with that is the idea that the model of the rentier state, this is something I am willing to go along with. Okay, this intellectually for me is a bit of a departure. I'm willing to go along with this idea that the model of the rentier state was viable. Was viable. A state, that is to say, that makes more money by clipping coupons, by foreign investment, by finance, basically, by things other than hiring labor and producing a product for a profit, something that sells on the market, what we normally think of as capitalism. I'm saying that this finance version of it was not inherently contradictory or um, full of holes. So if we're looking for an analogy, and here we're taking this in ideological terms, in terms of the globalism of our day, I guess that seems to say that the present globalization, which is based on finance capital more than on industrial capital, finance is the center of the world system today, that this is not inherently prone to fall apart for economic reasons at any rate, but maybe for other reasons. It's these other reasons that we're interested in most in this course. So why did it fall apart in World War I? I guess this draws us into a larger question of interpretation of the whole period of Anglobalization in the 19th century. This idea that was it based on hegemony? Now, I like the theory that says if you're asking why one currency, in this case the pound based on the gold standard, in our day the dollar based on no standard, if you're wondering why that becomes the ruling currency in the world, you don't get an economic answer to that question. You get a political one because that power was the leading power. So it's because the British won. The hegemony theory of money, I like to call that. Okay. So how did the British keep their hegemony? So you're following this, I guess, on our outline, why did globalization fail? And that's the first question I ask on the outline. Did it fail economically? I say no, really no. It failed because of the hegemony question. It failed politically. It failed because the British Empire failed. How did the British Empire fail in the 19th century? A pretty large question. Historians have talked about, there's an ocean of literature on this. The remarks that we're going to make in the next hour, 45 minutes or so, the arguments that we're going to make about it are going to have to be of a very, very general nature. We're going to have to talk about a lot of historical material about which volumes and volumes have been written by superb scholars, superb works of scholarship, I should say. So I'm taking a lot of liberties in generalizing from the grand lessons of all these things, and I've written about it in a pretty big book called "The Rise of the Global Powers," about international politics in the era of the World War. So the first part of that mainly presents some of the argumentation I'm going to make in the next half hour or so. How did the British fail to keep their hegemony? Well, first of all, they didn't dominate the world completely. They were not an empire. You could make the argument they didn't dominate the world in the 19th century as much as the United States dominates it militarily today. And by the way, I don't think it really dominates it militarily today. But much closer, much more so than the British Empire. The British Empire was built essentially on relations with other powers. And they knew it. John Robert Seeley, their most brilliant analyst, had written a book in the 1870s called The Expansion of England, which made the argument that the British didn't get there because of the wisdom of their constitutional tradition, because of the supremacy of their civilization, or anything like that. They got to the point of having this magnificent empire, which was going to get even more magnificent after he wrote. Remember, the book was published in 1872. They haven't even gobbled up Africa yet. It got that way, he said, not because of its institutions and their superiority, but because of the balance of power. Now, what do you mean by the balance of power? He meant it's the British diplomacy, its shrewdness, and we have to admire, and in fact, we have to be enormously impressed by the shrewdness of British diplomacy. Those who study diplomacy, who work for the State Department, who are diplomats, etc., if they know any history, they should know the history I'm talking about today. In fact, they should have read a lot more about that than just, backing up the things that I say today. How did the British gain the empire? By means of their balance of power. Hardly any works on this exactly. Most of the scholarship deals with all sorts of other aspects of imperialism, and of course, they're fascinating. You can see why the attention accrues to these things, but they don't deal with this fundamental question, how exactly, and write it in lucid terms. We don't want to read, 7 volumes of 800-page works on this. We want the thing put lucidly. How did the British manage to use this balance of power? Now, I can't answer that question right now. I can allude to it without answering it exactly. But I can say a little bit more about how it worked in the 19th century, this balance of power, and how the British used it to good advantage. Now, what does it mean exactly? Frequently, we hear a lot of, a lot of bunkum about the balance of power, how people who think in terms of the balance of power imagine some kind of system of stability. And in the United States, they like to talk about the U.S. pursuing a policy of balance of power, which means balancing fine equilibria and all of the rest of that. And they like to think of it not even involving war, because we don't want nuclear wars. We don't want to be balancing power by means of nuclear war, do we? I don't think there's anybody who argues that nowadays. And yet many of them advocate with enthusiasm balance of power policy on the part of the United States. I guess this is without war. What are they thinking about? How's this balance going to be achieved? How was it achieved by the British? By war. By war. So what it means exactly, the balance of power, if you really look at it, and very seldom do you see this ever argued, but I think it should be, it means a strategy pursued by the British over a long period of time, wittingly and unwittingly. It's said sometimes that Cardinal Wolsey, in the period of Henry VIII, back in the 16th century, in fact coined the term balance of power and used it to describe an efficacious British policy toward the Spanish and ultimately toward the French as well. And I guess the idea in the abstract means paying attention to those who are powerful and placing a counterweight against the most powerful of them. Now, frequently they say the balance of power is a coalition by all the little powers against Mr. Big. Nonsense. Nonsense. I've seen this argued by very wise people. Nonsense. It is not a coalition of little powers against Mr. Big. Mr. Big looks at a threat to Mr. Big and organizes others against that threat. And often, if he can't organize others, he takes note of the natural squawks that develop among the others, and he chooses carefully who he's going to side with, which weights he's going to put, so to speak, on the balance. So it is a policy of a hegemon, not a strategy against hegemony, a policy of a hegemon against a future hegemon or a threat to hegemony. That's the point. Not a policy of little powers against a hegemon. No. That's mythology. Okay, so if we start with that idea, look at the British balance of power in terms of wars of continental coalition against a continental power. And I'm not saying the British cook these up, although they do up to a point, but I'm not making that argument. The balance of power model is pretty much taking note of the continental antagonisms and siding with the ones who will oppose a British rival for overseas acquisition. For example, in the 18th century, the French. So in those cluster of wars in the middle of the 18th century, in which the side that the French supported lost and the side that the British supported won, the French were driven out of India. And so the French are never going to quarrel with the British. They're going to have some factories, so to speak, in India from this point on, but they're not going to have much to say against the British in India. So the British gained a considerable march on them. Similarly, drove them out of the New World. well, not exactly drove them out. I shouldn't put it so sharply as that, but weakened their position so much in the New World that the French are not really going to be quarreling with the British very much over uh, uh, territories north, soon to be called Canada, north of territories that are soon to be called the United States. So that's a result of the balance of power. British gained a march, so to speak, over the French with regard to the balance of power. I'm going to argue in a minute or two that they gained Suez in that same way. So, so the defeat then of France in the Napoleonic Wars by 4 different coalitions, all supported and subsidized by the British, very consistently against Napoleon and all his vast campaigns all over Europe. These were the wars that I think were most decisive in the career of the British balance of power strategy. The defeat of Napoleon, in effect, makes the British, I guess, a kind of hegemon. Not really. The British cannot call the shots, even in Europe. They can't call the shots. But they do have the largest and most impressive navy. So it does really free them up from naval competition for a while, until others start to build. The French are going to be building navy seriously in the 1850s, and will go away from sail in the 1850s and go over to steamships powered by coal. By the turn of the century, they'll be powered by oil. And so even while all this technology changes the naval equation dramatically, the British will still stay on top of it because of their industrial revolution, making that possible. And of course, their avid competition with the French, and what goes with that, their adroit use of the balance of power in their diplomacy. So that is something we need to take note of when trying to answer this question. After that, the British pretty much had control over India to the degree that by the 1850s and 60s, it will be a very thoroughgoing kind of control. They've always had a lot of influence in India and pretty much done what they want, but going to be much greater after the defeat of the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. So India is going to be the center of everything. We looked at that graph in our last lecture and looked how powerful the Indian economy was. Bear in mind the British have pretty much control over that. So that's where the British wealth comes from to a very, very considerable degree. Take away that wealth of India, and you can hardly say that the British are superior, at least in terms of their economy, over anybody else. That figures into our globalization model, doesn't it? And globalization, does it take into proper consideration the importance that India plays in the world economy and in profits that are garnered in England during this period in various ways? Not always properly appreciated in certainly, at any rate, by the economic historians who are generalizing on this. Although I'm not saying British economic historians don't pay plenty of attention to this. Of course they do. But about the people who are generalizing in the grand terms about globalization, this grand model, not all of them pay enough attention to that. And I guess we could say that this position that England has won as a result of the defeat of Napoleon is really a position that changes everything in their attitude toward Russia. But before we get to that, take a look at this cartoon, this model, this portrait of British power, how even Atlas, who's holding up the whole world, is dominated and controlled by Britain, and how this control by Britain is achieved not so much with their navy, although the navy is always implicit, but with the sturdy British soldier. There he is with a leopard for a pet. Interesting trope, the idea of a leopard for a pet, but there he is, quite a fellow, with his rifle, and of course he is ruling over the lesser peoples of the globe, and they're all paying their tribute to Britain, who sits atop the whole world the mistress of civilization, the greatest governing race on earth. It's later on going to be said. In fact, it's already said, but it's going to be said by reference to science, by reference to the latest Darwinist locutions having to do with science. All right, so let's see. Elsewhere, Britain is viewed differently. So, critic of the British Empire might say that Britain has imposed a Pax Britannica by way of its navy. There's an analogy with the United States today, by the way. And that as a result of this imposition of this hegemony over the whole world, the British have essentially devoured the whole world from the standpoint of the domination over peoples and the accumulation of riches. And these are going to be the British holdings, together with the other Europeans, around the world island by the turn of the 20th century. It's the period we're trying to understand today. The British, for the most part, are going to make pretty much short work of any kind of competition with any of their naval rivals. So you see from this that rivalries will come, if they come. I got a pointer here? Yes, I do. Rivalries will come, not out in the outer seas, but they'll come from the Russians, pretty much. Not China, but from the Russians. And where will the Russian thrusts come? They'll come toward the Straits and the Dardanelles, controlled by the Ottoman Empire. But if the Ottoman Empire declines, and it is said to be in a state of decline after Napoleon, the notion comes up that the Ottoman Empire may be declining relatively vis-a-vis the others. Later on, they're going to make this more stridently, and make this argument more stridently. And they're going to say it's in absolute decline, it's in decay, and all the rest of that. I suppose this is true up to a point, but it's mostly relative decline of the Ottoman Empire. And I say others have risen who are more powerful and who may make claims against it that they couldn't before. And then secondly, there's this path that goes through the Hindu Kush into the Indus Valley and into I haven't got it in there just exactly right, but into where the Indus Valley is, and it leads into India. It's about the only way you can attack India, and the only person who could do it would be the Russians. So the Russians can attack at the Straits, they can attack in India. They are a threat, that is to say, to these British interests. They be our maritime interests up to a point. And then, of course, we should include, before we're finished, a threat to the Far East, but that's not much until 1900, when when the Russians build a railway out to the Far East. Once they do that, once they have a railway to the Far East, that's something that the British Navy can't counter, so that's only the balance of power. That's to say, only some allies of the British can counter that expansion of Russian power. Now, the British didn't think this way about Russian power before Napoleon. They liked the idea of being friendly with Russia, and they were friendly and supportive of Russia. And they liked the idea of being friendly because it gave them an easier access into the Baltic, they thought, and perhaps easier access into the Black Sea. So they were thinking in terms that Russia might have the same interests as the British, might be useful to the British prior to Napoleon. After Napoleon's gone, it's the opposite. British policy starts to worry about the Russian threat in the Baltic, in the Black Sea at the Straits, threat to India through the Hindu Kush, threat in the Far East. Start to worry and start to see Russia as the biggest problem. And of course, the biggest threat is going to come at the turn of the century with regard to the Russian railways. Inside Europe, Britain also has to worry about a balance of power among these European great powers. And frequently the balance of power idea is suggested as some kind of way of understanding European politics. In fact, European politics is a fundamental setting of the theory of the balance of power. After Napoleon, Prince Metternich, Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian diplomat, he is the one who pretty much develops the idea of Austria as the centerpiece of a balance of power that will be of great use to the British after Napoleon. This will be the security system the British will have to rely on. There are some notes about Metternich's plan. He hates the French Revolution. Of course, he's been fighting against the French Revolution against Napoleon. He's really worried about it. He's got a landlord state, which is dominated by the nobility. They don't, anything having to do with the French Revolution is absolutely poison in their eyes. They want to keep the current nobility and absolute monarchies, keep them on their thrones, keep them in power indefinitely. And so he's a very, very right-wing kind of politician from the standpoint of the politics of the French Revolution. In geopolitics, that means keep France as weak as possible and restore what the Austrians call a balance of power. Is that the same thing as the British idea, the balance of power? Let me talk about that in just a second. And of course, the last note that's made here, restore royal families, restore the condition prior to the French Revolution, prior to Napoleonic revolutionary wars in Europe, restore them as much as possible. It isn't entirely possible, but as much as possible. So the European map then features a big Austria right in the middle and a lot of weak stuff all around, except for Russia. Russia's not weak. Russia's the one who's defeated Napoleon. But look at Central Europe. There's no real power in Central Europe. The Prussians are not really very powerful. They have some power, but they're not dominant. They're not Germany yet. Similarly, Sardinia is kind of important. The Kingdom of Sardinia in Italy is kind of important, but it's not Italy yet, not control of Italy. France has been defeated in the war. So von Metternich speaks to the British and says, we can hold a balance of power by means of a triple alliance, which will include, these three monarchs in Eastern Europe, all very right-wing characters. They all hate Poland. They don't want any kind of revolt in Poland. They've all got a piece of Poland that they took at the end of the 18th century, so they want Poland to emerge again. So it's Prussia, Russia, and Austria. Keep these three together, and since Prussia is not, terrifically powerful, and Russia is very powerful, the whole trick will be for Metternich to manipulate to manipulate Russia. And as long as those two are on the same page, nobody else can squawk about anything. The French will be isolated, and the British will be very happy with the situation. That is more or less Metternich's conception vis-a-vis the British. Is that Britain's conception? Is that the way the Brits see things? Well, they do for a while, at least until about 1822 or so. Congress of Verona, some people say. That's when the British start to change their mind. And it's true, they do watch the British continue, watch the French continue to get more powerful and certainly more restive, more revolutionary. The French have a revolution in 1830, bring Louis Philippe to the throne, and then the British quarrel a lot with the French and fight them on the seas in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1830s, when the French give a lot of approval to Muhammad Ali's warlike son, Ibrahim, who waged some battles against the Ottomans on the part of Egypt. And the French were encouraging that, but the British were defending the Ottoman Empire. So it's interesting. Mainly to oppose the French, I think, but of course they don't want to see the Ottoman Empire get torn up unless they're going to be part of the tearing. So all right, there are a number of these French episodes, British and French episodes, and there's even certain quarrel with Russia over Russia's opposition to the Greek Revolution in 1822. The British oppose Russia. They oppose France. You can see a kind of a pattern developing. It's going to be very strong as the century goes on. But the biggest thing occurs in the revolutions of 1848, which struck every European country, failed everywhere, except in France. Not everybody appreciates this properly. It didn't fail in France. They brought the nephew of Bonaparte himself back to power. And he talked revolutionary talk, not in terms of French society itself so much, although he was a kind of FDR, kind of a New Dealer in a way, in terms of his economic ideas. Not so much a laissez-faire type, although closer to laissez-faire than many people appreciate. But mostly, he wanted to break up this Metternick system. Now, Metternich had been chased off in 1848, so you'd think the French have an excellent opportunity. Where do they want to do it? They want to do it in the Far East. So their judgment is that these three Eastern monarchies are together. One has to act in such a way as to oppose the Russians, and maybe the naval power of Britain and France can be used in such a way to get through the Black Sea, to attack Russia, and to beat Russia back on Russia's coasts. Gee, that's ideal if you can handle Russia by attacking it on one of its coasts. Russia does not have a lot of coastline, certainly has no navy to worry about very much. That might be a way of controlling Russia. And so that's what happened in the Crimean War. We're overlooking a lot of detail with regard to the development of the conflict over Crimea, and just looking at the raw, the raw power politics of it, and looking at from a great distance, so that we can generalize the better. But on the whole, it was an attempt by the French to break up the Russian-Austrian alliance. And by the end of that, Russia and Austria were very much at odds. And to do this by war against Russia, together with the British. So the British take the view that they're not for this balance of power to the degree that they're going to leave Russia alone. No. So the British did not pursue a balance. In fact, they pursue a revolutionary and you might say Napoleonic strategy. For this, Queen Victoria is very unhappy with Palmerston, Lord Palmerston, and criticized him greatly because she thought he encouraged the French too much. Palmerston's thinking about British interests in the grandest imperial sense, and not necessarily in terms of ideology. He's pretty confident that the British are not going to be threatened by the ideas of the French Revolution, and they can maybe get some advantage out of cooperating with Napoleon. That's an interesting thought. Shows how supple British foreign policy was in the middle of the 19th century. It was not ideological, not inherently conservative or any of that. It was interested in whatever advances the British Empire, and in this case, revolution might advance the British Empire. At any rate, it's starting to cut against Russia. So this cartoon from Punch really kind of says a lot, I think, if you look very closely at it. Look at all these bees stinging the Russian bear. You can see they bear all kinds of different flags. I mean, Germans, Austrians, French, Brits, the Ottomans, they're in there too. So whoever's an enemy of Russia is probably a friend of the British. So the British are trying to oppose Russia, trying to limit Russia. Remember, they have this geopolitical antagonism on a world scale against Russia, not on a European scale, but on a world scale around the world island against Russia. To that end, Palmerston was willing to play ball. Excuse me. To that end, Palmerston was willing to play ball with Napoleon III. And this cartoon shows them in their naval race and they're building ships, against each other. And they're even kicking around the idea that maybe in this naval race, they might have some kind of way of communicating one to another about how to regulate the speed of the naval race. At any rate, there's a naval race. Remember, we're converting away from the age of sail at this moment. So these are big capital ships under coal power, fueled by coal. Make a lot of smoke, pretty awful things compared to the lovely ship of the line in the age of sail. But at any rate, new age for the navies, and the British and French navies in the forefront. Nobody else is in their league, in the forefront of this naval race, so to speak, kind of intermittent naval race. At the end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s, goes into the period of the American Civil War, about which the British and Napoleon more or less see eye to eye. I mean, that is to say, they want to see the Confederacy win the Civil War against the United States. Excellent. The United States probably be divided into 2 or 3 states, maybe more. Canada will be secure from the United States. Napoleon will set up shop in Mexico in support of a Catholic emperor, Maximilian, and he'll be a French, that is to say, if the Confederacy wins the war. The British are building ships for the Confederacy, and spiritually they are thinking in terms of the Confederacy, in terms of this whole grand economic system based on cheap cotton produced by slaves and for the British mills and all the rest of that stuff. So there's ample interest for the British to play ball with Napoleon. But none of that came to pass. In the end, they didn't have what it took. Nobody has what it takes. Nobody can advance. None of these European powers can get on the American mainland and defeat the United States. No. So there's the whole picture of the balance of power from the American standpoint. It's a joke from the American standpoint, the balance of power. The Americans have to worry about who's strong in Europe? No. Americans are defying everybody. British and French, you could say they're the 2 leading powers in the world. And even together, they haven't got what it takes even to begin to challenge the United States on the mainland. The British learned that at the end of the 18th century, cannot chase the Americans all over the American mainland. I mean, you can blockade them and really cause a lot of trouble with them. But you have to consider yourself, if you're British, you have to consider yourself lucky that the Americans have not taken Canada yet. You still have Canada. And Canada can expand just as fast toward the West Coast as the United States. So the British policy has to be kind of supple here. And moreover, the British have to deal with possible revolts in Canada, have to give them dominion status and all the rest of that, have to ease up on their empire. The British are very, very sophisticated when it comes to these diplomatic questions, not just crude military captains who get their way everywhere. A lot of supple policies required, and a lot of it is failing, of course. They do fail. They don't get any balance of power in the United States. Right away, that tells you that whatever else happens, they're not going to run the world by means of a balance of power. If you can't control the rise of the United States, there goes your balance of power, at least as hitherto conceived. And later on, you can make the same generalization about other places. Might even say it about Russia. But at any rate, during the same period, this revolt against this Austrian idea of a balance of power, it's pro-British, but it's Austrian, it's continental in nature and not global. The revolt took hold with Camillo Cavour, the head of the Piemontese government, who decided to make a pact with Napoleon, revolutionary Napoleon, to try to make a revolutionary war in Italy and unify Italy against the will of Austria. Against Austria. Everything is against Austria. Everything against, you could say everything is against the balance of power. Everything is against conservatism in the 19th century, especially in the middle of the 19th century. Well, as a result of these wars, we cannot follow them. It's fascinating stuff, great diplomacy, interesting stuff with all sorts of twists and turns, and I love this material, and I would love, of course, to lecture you, but that's not our course. We're trying to generalize, stand from a distance, and make generalizations about it all. The upshot is that they unified Italy and created Italy as a power. It had to be done with French help against Austria. Okay, so that whole lesson was taken by Count Otto von Bismarck for the Prussians. They would like to do the same thing for the Germanys as Cavour did for the Italys, and take advantage of this revolutionary period that is characterized by these initiatives in various ways of the French. And eventually will turn against the French. So once again, cannot go through all the machinations, but there's what's involved. The German Confederation, it's a question of whether, have I got my, yes I do, question of whether Prussia, which doesn't look like much here, can get its way over Denmark in 1864, over Austria in 1866, and over France to unify the Catholic states in 1870-71. These are 3 wars of national liberation, a German nationalist would say. Hitler would say that, but other German nationalists would say that. 3 wars, all of with very sophisticated diplomacy, not just brute force, but sophisticated diplomacy makes this possible because there's so many different powers involved, and you can't take them all on at once with brute force. So diplomacy is, and Bismarck was the most brilliant diplomatist of war that can be imagined. A great model for the Germans, and then I should say a very powerful model, not a great one, a powerful model for the Germans in the 20th century. And in those 3 wars in the 1870s, while the American Civil War was going on, and immediately in the aftermath of the American Civil War, a new Germany comes to, so a new Italy, a new Germany have come into being, and the United States has consolidated itself as a whole. All these things are against the idea of the balance of powers the Austrians have preached. Everything's against Austria. Austria is going to disappear in World War I. So it gives you an idea of the old idea of Metternickian conservatism. Kaput, going to disappear in World War I. And this is the Bismarckian system, which Bismarck managed to manipulate in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. This is also very sophisticated kind of diplomacy of combination, but kind of conservative, based fundamentally on trying to keep these 3 Eastern monarchs together, trying to keep France isolated. That's he shares in common with Metternick, and trying to play ball with Britain as much as possible. That means if the British steal a march against the French, as they do at Suez in 1875, when the British buy up the Khedive's shares in the Suez Canal and take over Suez Canal, something which really gives the French heartburn in view of the fact that the French are the ones who built the darn thing. Now the British have got control of it. Really stings. Really, really stings. This Bismarckian system is sort of a Metternickian system. There's some elements in common with Metternich. And he's conservative too. He represents the East Albion Junker landlord class and similar classes. And he gives a kind of a fillip of encouragement to conservatives, who, that is to say, people who want to keep the aristocracy in control of a modernizing old regime. A regime that's modernizing, but doesn't give the bourgeoisie a chance, doesn't give them a constitution, uses democracy against the bourgeoisie if possible, without yielding to it, of course. Well, that is the Bismarckian model. None of this is going in a way that's favorable to the British, except for this. Look at this. After the French were defeated in these various wars which they opposed, wars of Bismarck to unify Prussia, and the British get control of Suez, they now have a short route to India. So look at the distance. It's about half the distance to go by the short route to India as by the long route. But look at the question this raises strategically from a grand historical standpoint. It raises the question of controlling all those areas along that short route and along that long route. And so it has a kind of implicit suggestion that the British have to be interested in inland acquisitions in Africa. So what will develop at the end of the 19th century, the last decades of the 19th century, is a scramble among all the European powers, led by Britain, you have to say, participated in by the Germans. They're kind of regulated by the Germans, in fact. It's the Germans who created their so-called colonial marriage with the French and stopped the British seizure of Cabinda at the mouth of the Congo in 1884. And the British got some colonies out of it. They regulated, they got a voice in Africa after that. And so there will be an Anglo-German antagonism, you could even say, Anglo-French antagonism, Anglo-everything antagonism over colonial acquisitions from this point on. And of course, the seizure of Africa. So Africa, we cannot go into the scramble for Africa. The diplomacy of it is fascinating and in my opinion, can be conceived of in original ways. But we can't go into that in terms of our course. It's vast oceanic kind of, so to speak, scramble, which ends up with a lot of different powers getting power in Africa. French are going to get a lot of this area and here. The British are interested in a line that runs from the Cape to Cairo and a railway going down this distance that they think will pretty much dominate Africa. And the French pretty much interested in some kind of railway to link Djibouti here with their possessions in west of Africa. They have those interests. And then you have Belgians and Portuguese, and, Spanish, and so a lot of different forces at work in Africa, and the independent Boers, who will be conquered by British power. And the British are not always doing this with diplomacy. They're doing this with force. And by the 1890s, they're using a lot of force. They're using machine guns against people with spears for the most part, but even so, it's using tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of British troops. So the idea that the British never fight and the British Army doesn't play a big role seems to be, that's generally a good starting thought, but generally that doesn't seem to be the case by the end of the century. The British are using their power in a very big way. So what's the attitude of the Germans toward all of this? The Germans take the view that, the Germans under Bismarck and really under his successors take the view that they want to play ball with Britain as much as possible, even if they have to oppose it a little bit, play ball as much as possible. And the British take the view in the 1880s and 90s under Lord Salisbury, they take the view that they're a silent partner in the German alliance system, Anglo-German amity. There goes the idea of the balance of power, that when a threat comes up, a rival comes up, the hegemon, the British, automatically form a coalition against it. No, there's the alternative of appeasement. A big thing and a big factor in British diplomacy. So they're appeasing Germany. You see the advantage of being allied with Germany in Europe, on European questions, in view of the fact that their main problem is Russia with regard to with regard to Eurasian questions, as we already indicated. So they do not want, the British, do not want Germany and Russia to be cooperating. No. If Germany and Russia are cooperating, it's hard to oppose that. So they want to do anything they can to keep them apart. Playing ball with Germany, that might help. But also a lot of other factors come into it. We cannot explore them all in brief compass, but those are the general building blocks. We're asking the question about the balance of power in the age of globalization. And how about the role of the United States? The United States, British failed to keep it divided at the time of the Civil War. They never did, declare war against the United States or make a peep, really, although they did build ships for the Confederacy. And they did encourage Napoleon III in Mexico. No getting around that. But the victory of the United States means Napoleon's candidate, Maximilian, he's gone. He goes out. He's driven out of office. The United States gives ultimata to the French to get out of Mexico, and then to the Mexicans to get rid of Maximilian. And of course, that happens. Nobody's going to oppose that from this point on. There's no balance of power in the United States, in the North America, in the New World. There's not going to be any balance of power. Well, how about the Monroe Doctrine? The United States has a Monroe Doctrine vis-a-vis Latin America. Talk about that in just a second. Here's the way Alfred Thayer Mahan, the big naval theorist of the United States, who wrote The Influence of Sea Power on History in 1890, it went into, I don't know how many different editions, different printings, probably still in print right now. Huge influence everywhere, but he didn't say very much about the United States. Of course, he goes on about the British Navy and how important the British Navy has been in history, but he didn't say much about the United States, except to say that no foreign power should be within 8 ship days of the American West Coast, otherwise they would annex the American West Coast. So within 8 ship days, that means Hawaii. Got to keep Hawaii out of the hands of any foreign power. So the foreign powers are going all over the place at this point, annexing everything on the planet. Germans have got colonies in the Marianas, the Marshalls, Carolines. So nobody should quarrel with American control over Hawaii, Mahan says. And also, think about the Mediterranean, he says, as if it were like, think about the Caribbean. I let the cat out of the bag there. Think about the Caribbean as if it were the Mediterranean. The way the British like to think about the Mediterranean, they want anybody to quarrel with them there. They want naval supremacy. The United States ought to seek that in the Caribbean. So that is not a worldwide power projection. That is just a defense, continental, you might say continental naval defense of the United States in the age of coal, in which you needed coaling stations, in which is the question of how many ship days you were away from some objective. So that's all Mahan had in mind, but it's very considerable because it goes with the notion of the Monroe Doctrine. Moreover, after the Civil War, the Russians began to say that Britain had been their main opponent, perfectly right, and one way to give the British heartburn was to give Alaska to the United States. So Alaska now is going to vie with Canada for control of this coast, and they have a number of fascinating little quarrels about fisheries and all sorts of little matters like that. What's really at stake is whether Canada is going to have a Pacific coast, and the Canadians are building a railway just as enthusiastically as the Americans are building a railway. So to try to make sure that nobody can get out to the Pacific coast and do some filibustering like they did in Hawaii in order to seize it for the other. If suppose the Americans, for example, were to get some a rail connection that takes them to the Canada coast and end up outnumbering British citizens on the, or I should say people loyal to British loyalists on this coast, Canada might not have any coast at all. So there's a little bit of a push and pull in court and other places between the United States and Britain over Canada. And in 1895, the Brits joined with the Germans in making an attempt to collect debts from the government of Venezuela. 1895, the United States said, no, get out. The United States defied Britain, invoked the Monroe Doctrine, and threatened Britain in no uncertain terms. Teddy Roosevelt, in fact, said, if the United States and Britain actually come to war, the United States will seize Canada. The United States will seize Canada. So the British had to decide. They could not break up the United States. Now it's a question of, can they extend any of their interests against the United States, against the Monroe Doctrine. Is the Monroe Doctrine, this old thing from 1823, is it still in effect in 1895? The answer is yes. Yes, it is. The British at this point made a huge decision. Lord Salisbury made a huge decision. So we're not going to oppose the United States anymore. Never on anything. So all these questions having to do with this coast, the British yield. So you note that we have this strange coastline here in which the Alaska coast advances, so to speak, against Canada. I mean, these are not hugely important ports, but those were the questions at issue. This question of a Panama Canal. In a treaty of 1850, it says that the United States and Britain, if they ever build this canal, they'll own it jointly. Well, they rewrote that thing. And the new treaty says, if the United States builds it, the United States started to in 1900, it's going to belong to the United States, not Britain. So the British have yielded on everything. British yield on everything. And what do they get from this? They get the special relationship with the United States. Bear in mind, the United States, the country, is going to, in effect, eclipse them eventually in the really broad picture that we historians can employ. Really going to eclipse them. But in 1895, they say, let's think of it as the English-speaking peoples. Let's even kick around the idea. And the Brits continue to kick this idea through the 19th century, kick this idea around, and eventually the United States and Britain will become one state in some way, somehow. Hard to see how, but that eventually might happen. So that's a huge choice on the part. None of this stuff jibes with the balance of power. The Brits are yielding every place. The British believe in appeasement. You have to appease. They have to appease. Appeasement has to be there. They like to appease the Germans. They'd like to appease the United States. Those are their two biggest possible rivals. And that's the policy of the balance of power. It is not a policy of balancing. You can't balance. You cannot balance on a world scale. I guess maybe one lesson would be the British could balance as long as the balance of power was strictly a European question among European great powers. Now that it's among global powers and it involves all these other questions all over the earth, of course it always involves some questions all over the earth, but now that you have big powers outside of Europe, the balance of power. Can't do the balance of power anymore. It won't work in the same way. That's interesting for us. We ought to learn that lesson. We ought to understand that thing a little better than we do, I would think. How about the Russians? So the British really have no way of controlling Russia. With regard to the Straits, they can defend the Ottoman Empire, which they do. With regard to India, mistakenly called China here on this map, and it's India. Is that right? Yes, I believe so. It's called China. But with regard to India, the Russians still are going to maintain a kind of threat via their railroads to advance on India by land. The British haven't got what it takes to meet large Russian armies. They don't know what to do about that. The only way that can be stopped is by the balance of power. Somebody has to be got to quarrel with or fight Russia, weaken Russia in some way. Who would that be? Well, it's a question throughout the 19th century, and there are many episodes that we could talk about, but once again, time forbids us from doing so. But the matter becomes very acute in the 1890s when Count Witte, the British or the Russian finance minister, sponsored a great drive to build a rail line through Siberia. So once again, it's railroads. In Mackinder's terms, world political terms, it's sea power versus railroads. Sea power versus land power, or land power troops transported by rail. It's going to be the main thing, the main component of land power, until the tank appears. And the tank really won't appear until World War II. At any rate, what are the British going to do about this rail line, which Count Witte promised the Tsar would make Russia a supreme all around its periphery, especially in the Far East. Russia would control China. And after the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the Russians occupied Manchuria. Ouch. What to do about that? British are really worried about their possessions in the Far East. They make a lot of money from these things. How to counter all of this? And the answer that Salisbury had for the thing was splendid isolation and friendship with Germany as much as you can get it. Well, we couldn't get it. And most of all, he would love to get Germany to fight Russia in some way. Can't do it. Can't get them, can't break those two up. The British finally turned to the Japanese. The prompting was German cooperation with the Franco-Russian alliance against Japan after the Japanese defeated China in a war in 1895. The Far Eastern Triplice, it was called. It allowed the Russians to advance their power against the Japanese sphere of influence. Japanese had pretty much got their way over China, so this is against Japan. Allowed the Russians to get their way over the Japanese, and allowed the Germans to come in and actually seize Kiaochao in 1897, a naval base for the Germans in the Far East, if you can imagine that. And mainly it's Germany plus the Franco-Russian alliance. It's the Continental League against Britain. Britain can't deal with that. The balance of power. You've got to be able to split and divide people to have a balance of power. And if they won't divide, gee, you're in difficulty. What to do? Problem cannot be solved within the European system of great powers. And the British had to reach out for the Japanese. In racial terms, this is a little bit of a departure because, the very latest Darwinian science seems to say the white man runs the world, should run the world, will run the world. Japanese are other. So combination with Japanese and then against white men. The combination with Japan isn't worth a nickel unless it's against Russia. Try to drive the Russians out of Manchuria, as you see indicated on the map, with all these other dots to indicate the treaty ports that the imperialist powers have. They're getting ready to carve up China if possible. The United States doesn't want any of them to carve up China, but it's a question that has to be settled dynamically by events, and nobody can tell exactly what events are going to develop. At any rate, the British decided the only people who could oppose the Russians were the Japanese. So they made an alliance in 1902, and Japanese attacked Russia in 1904-05, Russo-Japanese War. They defeated Russia. British were very proud of this agreement with Japan. They thought it was quite brilliant. Lord Lansdowne, its architect, claimed a lot of credit for it. Salisbury's a great diplomat, but he had never managed this. But Lansdowne succeeded where Salisbury didn't. And they now have an alliance with Japan. That's going to start World War I, in my view. Complicated process. In fact, my book goes into this at some length, but I'm afraid we haven't got the time for it here. The essence of the thing is that there's a Franco-Russian alliance, and that when the Japanese attacked Russia with British encouragement, the ally of Russia, France, might have ended up in a war with Britain. Britain couldn't have that. She only wanted Russia defeated in the Far East. Britain did not want a war with France, too. Did not want a general war. So Britain came to terms with France. When it came to terms with France in 1904, it opened up the door not only to an alliance with France, but an alliance with the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. And that turns into the Triple Entente that went to war in 1914. Now, a good deal more to this than I am indicating, but these are the general patterns of the balance of power that are giving us World War I. At any rate, the alignment that produced World War I. There are a lot of other events of a revolutionary character that transmitted the changes in the Far East through the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Young Turks Revolution, revolutions in the Balkans, and all the rest of that, translated all that Far Eastern, those Far Eastern issues, translated them, so to speak, into Europe through the Balkans. Anyhow, that's a war, World War I. Imperialist politics of the most aggressive kind that we've ever seen. I mean, I don't see anything comparable to it today. The most aggressive kind, in which the British cannot possibly control this. They are scurrying to keep up with these events and hastening the onset of war in this scurrying. Hard to go back and look at this period and say, this would have prevented war, that would have prevented war. There's a whole industry of historians trying to do that. They don't succeed so brilliantly, in my opinion. I think the war is quite inexorable when you really consider the scope of the antagonisms of the imperialists, and they're of global scope. So when we talk about globalism, and if it's based on a British Empire, Britain's not the only empire in the world. There are all these other empires, and the British can't control them all. In fact, the reverse. All they can do is participate if they want to try and get through this thing somehow through a balance of power. About the only hope would be a war, a general war, World War I, in which the Germans were defeated. That would be something. It wouldn't solve the problem of the Americans, but at any rate, it would be something. That's the way things went. So quite a dilemma for the British. They cannot do all the things you would imagine when you consider the Anglobalization model. Look how economics fails in the world of politics, in the cruel world of politics. The bankers can't run the world. The gold standard can't run the world. No. Economics has to fit into the interstices of politics. Now, one other point that we often neglect, but we have to consider in a way, in sympathy even, as ironic as that sounds, with the British trying to maintain all of this by means of the balance of power and by imperialism. And if we looked at the thing ideologically, and we really should, because the revolutionary events of this period are about as important as the other things I've talked about, the geopolitics of it. In fact, relationship between revolutionary events and the geopolitics, that's the interesting relationship, not the relationship between that and the gold standard. But at any rate, if we did look at it this way, we'd really have to appreciate the tremendous ideological and spiritual torment of the Europeans confronting all the new ideas from the period, not only the ideas of the French Revolution, there's Marxism, anarchism, all these revolutionary ideas, but there are also developments in science, and some of these come out of British political economy. Darwin's notion of natural selection was inspired, Darwin says, was inspired by British political economy and its model of competition. That gave him the mechanism that he was looking for to generalize about the origin of species. So social Darwinism and British political economy have an intimate relationship. And then, of course, the interpreters of Darwin at the end of the century were going to enormous lengths about superiority of the race, the British race. British is a great governing race, and race is the term they always use. They don't say just the British people or the British state or anything, so much as they say the British race. It's up against other. In India, they say the British race is a demigod by comparison with the Indians. They look to the British as gods, and the British fear that one day the Indians may discover that there are other white people, the Russians, who are just as godlike as they. This sounds like Kipling and the Man Who Would Be King, doesn't it? So social Darwinism is driving them. Very important in the United States. Success of Jim Crow fits into this picture, like the bones of a skull. Jim Crow emerges as pretty much the law of the land by the time of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It's civilization doing battle with these lesser peoples all over the world. Lesser breeds without the law, Kipling called them. Civilization against barbarism, against this barbarism, of course, any of the sternest measures have to be used. Of course, it's war. So the balance of power is not a doctrine of equilibrium, it's a doctrine of war. How do we sum things up then? The neoconservative mythology about the Anglobalization and the British model in the 19th century generally makes the argument that the liberal Brits are doing battle with autocracy and one thing or another on the continent, and has a kind of a little model of not the French Revolution, but maybe, I don't know, the English tradition or something. And it makes it out that this is the central antagonism in world politics and a historical underpinning for today's color revolutions all over the world. I don't think so. I mean, there's a mythological picture. This is a just wild distortion, in my opinion, of the past. The globalized system under the gold standard, under free trade, under all of the rest of that, with all its complications, it might have been viable economically, but it could not be defended. Certainly not by the balance of power, not by the defense of British imperialism. The only way British imperialism could even try to defend itself was to advance the claims of the British race, the natural governing race, the British thought. Big people and small all agreed on this in the 19th century by means of war. World War I had its accidental aspects. The crisis of 1914. It's interesting to follow it in detail, and I do that. I've written about that. But it's better to appreciate the bigger picture when you consider the necessity of defending globalization by means of war. Okay, what does that mean for us? Do we have to defend globalization now by means of war? That would be the last question. I can't answer all these questions, but that's about the last thing we need to say, I guess, about the globalization of the 19th century in terms of the balance of power. All right, from here we have to go on to deglobalization and other models, the Keynes and the New Deal and the revolutionary aspects of things created by the Russian Revolution, also product of World War I. So we'll take those things up as we continue.